this morning. The Gift of Remembrance by U.S. Army Chaplain George Tiger. Memorial Day is not to be celebrated. It is to be observed, scrutinized, and witnessed on behalf of the true witnesses of our human failure to love our neighbor as ourselves. They are ghosts now, haunting lives with the gift of remembrance, so that we will not forget their living, but even more, that the grief of remembering will create in us a yearning for peace that will stir us to action. Our opening hymn is by special request of John Downing. Eternal Father, strong to save.
Eternal Father, strong to save, whose on the fight the restless wave, who bids the mighty ocean deep its appointed limits keep. Oh, hear us when we cry to thee for those in peril on the sea.
I wrote these words in Afghanistan in honor of a small fellowship of Unitarian Universalists I was privileged to serve at Kandahar Airfield. Burst to light up the night and to feed the soul's delight. Here the chalice burns bright and burns strong. Using all our reason, building till the dream is done. Here the chalice burns bright and burns strong. Open minds from the start, helping hands, loving heart. Here the chalice burns bright and burns strong. Free from creed, dogma too, principles to guide us through. Here, the chalice burns bright and burns strong.
Rise up, O flame, by thy light glowing, bring to us beauty, vision, and joy.
So generally our sharing moment is often geared toward children. I didn't see any children in the audience today and thought I would share a little bit of my own background. Diane asked me and John to work on this together, as both of us have some experience with the military. I've never served, never worn the uniform. I have worked for the US Army, I worked for the US Navy, and I married a United States Marine. So I spent 10 years as the wife of an active duty Marine. And my father served in World War II, as perhaps many of your own fathers did, and mothers perhaps. And so the military has been a bigger part of my life than I have ever had imagined. When I joined a Unitarian Universalist church for the first time, I was in Patuxent River, Maryland, and it was a very military community. There's a large military Navy base there. And so there were an awful lot of military people around, and it never even occurred to me that there was any conflict or issues being Unitarian Universalist and associated with the military. So when I went to other congregations and found that there was quite some resistance, I was surprised. Perhaps I was naive to be surprised, but I wasn't prepared for that. The Unitarian Universalist denomination we have our own little chalice with a pentagon symbol for the military. The UUA does support military folk who are UUs. We have military chaplains who are Unitarian Universalists. And they actually find perhaps it a little easier to be a chaplain. As a military chaplain, you have to minister to everyone who comes to you, no matter what their faith is and what your faith is. And so UUs perhaps have a little bit more practice working with people of a variety of faiths, backgrounds, and beliefs. And so they work with everybody who comes to them. And so that's a picture from a few years ago. One of our UU chaplains won Military Chaplain of the Year, and she was also awarded a Bronze Star. The UU bookstore has several books specifically for folks in the military. Recovering from Moral Injury After War, War Zone Faith, and Bless All Who Serve, which is a small book you can carry with you and has prayers and reflections and that sort of thing. So sort of like people take Bibles with them into battle. This is designed to fit into the pocket of a military uniform. There is a Unitarian Universalist military ministry, and you may recognize that picture. That's the fellow we just saw light the chalice with his 3 children in 2014. And so the UUA does support military folk and sees that there is a path where people can do both, and recognizes, I think, perhaps that those of us who do work with the military or in the military find ourselves faced with many moral dilemmas, and the UU faith can be helpful in helping us navigate them and survive them. We usually start with a singing bowl to lead us into silence, and today we're going to enter into our meditation silence with the sound of taps instead of a singing bowl.
Good morning. I was asked to talk about my military service, so I'll tell you a little bit about my time in the U.S. Navy. For our Memorial Day service to commemorate those who have given their lives in service to the country to try to maintain our freedom. I started in medical school at the University of Louisville in 1958, thinking I probably wanted to be an internist or a family practitioner, probably go back to my hometown of Tompkinsville in Monroe County, a little metropolis of a couple of thousand people. It was during the Cold War with Russia. There was a draft on. All physicians had a 2-year military obligation after they finished their internship. Graduated from medical school in 1962, took a medical internship at Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas. That's the same hospital where President Kennedy ended up a little over a year later after I had left. 1 month into the internship, I knew I definitely did not want to be an internist. A lot of it had to do with the head of the department. He was a genius, but he had to prove it to everybody, and it was very stressful. I had some interesting experiences. One, I was on call in the intern's room, asleep, and I heard some noise at the nurse's station. I called up to ask what was going on, and the nurse told me I better stay where I was, that there was a man up there, said that I had gotten an autopsy on his sister, to cut her up, and that he was looking for the doctor who did that so he could cut him up. The police came and suggested it would be a good idea if I started carrying a gun. Didn't have any more problem after that, but he did follow the nurse home and park in front of her house for a while until she called the police. While I was in my internship, I heard about the Navy Flight Surgeon School, School of Aerospace Medicine. I decided right off that going into the Navy was probably better than going into the Army. And flying sounded like fun. So I signed up, and it was a 6-month school at the Naval Air Station in Pensacola, Florida. Now, what do flight surgeons do? We take care of pilots, their families, the crew of the squadron. We primarily make sure that pilots are physically fit to fly. Vision is very important in flying. So there was a lot of the school that had to do with ophthalmology. We had a great teacher. He got me hooked on ophthalmology, and that's when I decided to go into that specialty. The last month of the training, we did basic flight training along with the Navy and Marine cadets. And if we could qualify at the end, we got to solo in a T-34 single engine prop plane, and I did get to solo in it. And that was a lot of fun. After I finished the school, I was sent to the Marine Corps Air Station in Cherry Point, North Carolina, and was assigned to an A-4 Skyhawk squadron. The Skyhawk is a single engine jet, single seater, and it's used primarily for close air support and bombing. It's called an attack aircraft, and it's the aircraft that John McCain was flying over North Vietnam when he got shot down. while I was at Cherry Point, we got to do an overseas trip. It's the first time I'd ever been across the Atlantic. We went to Oslo, Norway to pick up a group of Marines who had finished a winter exercise, NATO exercise. We went in a C-130 4-engine turboprop on the left. I took a nap while we were going over, woke up and it sounded funny, and I looked out of the window to my left, and the inboard engine in the plane was stopped and feathered. And I looked down and there were a whole bunch of icebergs, and we were coming up on Greenland, which is very misnamed. It's all ice. We did finally get okay to Oslo and got to spend a few days there and sightsee, which was very enlightening. They have all sorts of museums. Okay, a requirement of anybody who is on flight status is that you get 4 hours of flight time per month to get paid, flight pay. So my squadron had single seat planes, so I had to scrounge around and find somebody who had an open seat, usually in a trainer, who was willing to take me up. This is a T-33. It's a 2-seat single engine jet. And a friend of mine, another flight surgeon there named Chuck, he found a lieutenant, Marine lieutenant, who was willing to take him up, and he signed up for a flight with him. Now, tell you a little bit about getting out of aircraft if you have a problem. With high performance jets, you have to be shot out. You have to be fired out with an ejection seat. And the ejection seats have 3 safety pins, so they don't go off while they're parked on the ground. But the pilot got in the front seat, took out the pin over his head and the face curtain, threw it over the side. The pins are connected with a canvas lanyard. All 3 are connected together. And he eventually fired up the aircraft and they took off. Almost immediately, there was a loud clanking and he thought he had an engine failure. Told Chuck to eject, which he did. The plane crashed. Chuck came down in the fireball, did manage to run out, but he got burned pretty badly. The pilot couldn't eject because the noise was the pin he had tossed over banging against the side. The other 2 pins were in, so the ejection seat didn't fire. Silly, careless error. You don't do things like that. You go by the book. The crew chief should have taken out the pins, make sure all of that was cleared. We only had 1 accident in my squadron while I was flight surgeon. We were deployed to an auxiliary field in the Great Dismal Swamp in Eastern Virginia. And 3 of my pilots were returning from a mission. They were lining up for a landing. They were in a V formation. The lead pilot signaled to the pilot on the left to drop back, move over to the right to form a staggered single line so that they could break for landing. Unfortunately, he hit the plane on the right as he was moving across. Both planes immediately went out of control. They're at 1,200 feet. The first pilot was able to eject fine. The second one, the plane was rolling. He ejected really too low for the chute to fully open. He landed in a square mile plowed field. There was 1 tree in the middle of the field. Everything else was just bare ground. He landed in the tree. The tree caught him, broke his fall. He had some minor injuries, but survived. That's luck. Okay, I was due to get out in 1966. And at that time, Vietnam was really heating up. President Johnson was sending over hundreds of thousands of troops. We had secret wars in Cambodia and Laos. And there was a rumor that we were going to be extended. I wanted to take an ophthalmology residency, so decided I probably better go ahead and take it in the military. I signed up for their program in Philadelphia at the Philadelphia Naval Hospital. It was an excellent program. There are 5 medical schools in Philadelphia, and we had relations with all of them and got to go to all their conferences. I spent nearly a year at one of the best eye hospitals in the country, Wills Eye Hospital. Then I was moved, when I finished my 3-year residency, I was moved to the Naval Hospital in Jacksonville, Florida. Had an interesting happening there. One day we got a message from the carrier Independence, which was running operations off the coast of Jacksonville. And the message was, we have a sailor with a red eye and we need to have you send an ophthalmologist out to take care of him. My boss didn't think that was such a good idea. He said, no, you send him in here and we'll put him in the hospital and take care of him here. They went back and forth 3 or 4 times and finally admitted, well, the sailor who had an eye problem was the captain of the ship. If he left the ship, he lost his command. So they flew me out and I spent a week on the Independence treating his eye and watching air ops day and night, which is fascinating. Finished my active duty in 1971 and set up practice in Bowling Green. At that time, I had 8 years of active service, so I decided to stay in the Naval Reserve and retired in 1984 with 21 years of service. Got to go to some very interesting places when I was in the reserve. They sent me to Hawaii and Key West and all the way out to Adak in the Aleutian Islands once. It's right next to Russia. It was a listening base for trying to figure out what the Russians were doing. And we had a lot of spy flights that were flying out of there. I'm proud of my military service. I was commanding officer of the Medical Reserve Unit in Nashville for several years before I retired. This is a picture that was taken shortly before I retired from the reserve. That's one of my grandsons. He is now about 3 inches taller than I am and has a family of his own.
In 1948, Harry Truman issued an executive order saying that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed forces without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. Frederick Douglass, during the Civil War, had once said, "Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letter U.S., let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket, and there is no power on earth that can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship." Over to the left is a list of just some of the colored troops, the infantry's regiments that they had. There were about 4 pages more of those.
I want to talk a little bit about integration in the military. Black men have served in every war from the Revolutionary War on. The first person killed in the Revolutionary War in 1970 at the Boston Massacre was Crispus Attucks. Crispus was an escaped slave. He was half African, half Native American. And during the Revolutionary War, there were a lot of runaway slaves who served both with the American side and the British side, with the promise that they would be freed after the war if they did. In the Civil War, there were 186,000 black men who served. 4% of them were officers. They were in a lot of combat and earned 16 medals of honor. That takes a great deal of courage and guts. And again, runaway slaves were promised freedom if they joined. There were also free blacks from the North who were in the military in the Civil War. In World War II, there were 1.2 million black men who served in segregated units. Generally had white officers. They were trained usually in bases in the South. Now, this is in segregation times, and they were not treated well off the bases. There were a lot who were beaten, there were some who were lynched. And then once they got through training, they were usually assigned to be laborers or work in the cook in the for food called messmen. One battle where black men were used was the Battle of the Bulge in Belgium. It was the last German major offensive. We had so many people who were killed or wounded that they were running very short. So they scraped up everybody they could find, sent a pretty large number of black men in, and they served quite well and with valor. A very interesting story in the Second World War is the Tuskegee Airmen. They were the first black military pilots. They were uh, recruited and trained mostly around Tuskegee, Alabama, and flew fighter aircraft. Uh, they were called the Red Tails, one of the squadrons, because they painted the tails of their plane red. And they were very good escorts for bombers and helped keep a lot of bombers from being shot down by protecting them from German fighters. The movie Red Tails is well worth seeing, and it's reasonably factual if you haven't seen it. Very well done. Okay, after World War II, President Truman had been a racist all his life, had an epiphany and realized how badly blacks were being treated, and in 1948 put out an executive order saying everyone in the military is going to be treated equally. There'd be equal treatment and opportunity. Again, this is in segregation all over the country. Segregation with the Jim Crow laws in the South and in the North by custom. And there was a lot of pushback if anybody tried to get out of line. The country was still, as I said, segregated, both in the North and the South. Now, when recruits came in, they were all given the same entrance test. Most blacks had poor education and didn't do very well on it and ended up in the more menial jobs. I can tell you a little bit about black education in Kentucky in the 50s. I was in school in Monroe County. We had really quite good schools, good teachers, books. We had a fairly large section of blacks in the town, and they had one two-room school. It went up to eighth grade. Anybody who wanted to go past eighth grade had to go to a boarding school in Elizabethtown. The only person I knew who actually did that was the daughter of a lady who worked for my parents. She went there, finished high school, went to nursing school, moved to Chicago. The test was eventually made more culturally inclusive, and uh, a lot more black men at this time were able to get into higher levels of technical skills in the military. But in the military, everybody has the same standards and opportunities for a given rank or rate. You have to. You have to be able to trust that the person next to you knows what their rate or rank says they know. And in the military, rank trumps skin color. You look at a lieutenant, and if he outranks you, you salute him. The integration of all our military services was complete in the mid 1950s, before the civil rights movement began in civilian life. During the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement really cranked up. There was a ruling by the Supreme Court in 1954 called Brown versus Board of Education, which ended legal segregation in schools. There was a ruling called Plessy from the 1890s which said, oh, it's okay to be segregated as long as they're equal. Well, the Supreme Court proved they were not even close to equal anywhere, like in Tompkinsville. Uh, it didn't happen overnight for sure. There was a lot of pushback. There had to be troops sent in to help integration of several universities in the South. And it took a long time to even get going at all. Schools on military bases were integrated with President Truman's order in 1948. There was a lot of civil society resistance north and south to equal rights and integration. Rosa Parks in Birmingham, a lady who uh, refused to give up her seat to a white person on a Birmingham city bus, was arrested and put in jail. Dr. King organized a bus boycott, and they wore down the city of Birmingham. Finally, won in about a year, but it took an awfully lot of organization and time and a lot of hard feelings. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 helped a lot legally, and there was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In the South, very few blacks were allowed to be registered to vote. They would ask them all sorts of crazy questions uh, to deny them the right to vote by saying that they weren't educated. Didn't ask the questions to whites. Generally, black organizations supported military service because they saw it as a way to full equality of citizenship. In 1961, the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, charged commanding officers of American bases to foster equal treatment both on and off base. Before that, a lot of places blacks could go very few places, restaurants or anywhere else off base because of segregation. Uh, the Vietnam War became very unpopular in the 60s, and the military justice system was not always fair. There was often unequal punishment for minor infractions, and often black men were given longer sentences and more punishment than whites. During the 60s, blacks were becoming more militant and less patient of taking time, and there were race riots all over the country, uh, particularly in Boston, Los Angeles, Detroit. There's still sections of Detroit which were burned out in the 60s and that have never been rebuilt. There's still some problem with unequal promotion in upper ranks. It's improving over time, but it is slow. There are more field grade, that's major and above, and general officers, generals in the services that are black or Hispanic, people of color. But again, this is being really paid attention to, and they keep looking harder for qualified people to fill upper ranks, and are doing pretty well. There was the Defense Race Relations Institute, which was started in 1970. This was a 7-week school, and both officers and non-commissioned officers were sent to study how to get along better, how to improve relations between people of different backgrounds and races. Uh, they would be trained and then go back into their home units and apply some of the things that they had learned about getting along better and better toleration. And that has been very successful. Fair treatment is very important in the military. You're going to be fighting side by side, and you have to be able to depend on each other. So there's a really serious ongoing attempt for everybody to be treated equally and given the same opportunities. We have a lot of progress. It's not perfect. There are still areas that need work, like more upper rank officers and enlisted who are black. The Secretary of Defense currently is Lloyd Austin. Lloyd is a black retired Army general, very competent gentleman. And over the past 70 years, the military has successfully integrated first Black men, then women. Women weren't allowed to be in the actual services until sometime in the 60s. They integrated male nurses into the nurse corps. There was a lot of pushback from the nurses about that. And in the last few years, they're doing pretty well with gays. Still some problems, particularly that Trump started with trans people. But the military has consistently been way ahead of the civil society in addressing race relations and systemic racism. We have a long way to go in civil society, fair amount of way to go in the military, but I am proud that we have made as much progress as we have. After I got off active duty, I was very surprised at how much remaining racism there was in society after working with people of all backgrounds and colors. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat and I will try to answer them.
Spirit of life, whom we have called by many names in thanksgiving and in anguish, bless the poets and those who mourn. Send peace for the soldiers who did not make the wars, but whose lives were consumed by them. Let strong trees grow above graves far from home. Breathe through the arms of their branches. The earth will swallow your tears while the dead sing. No more, never again. Remember me. For the wounded ones and those who received them back, let there be somebody ready when the memories come, when the scars pull, when the buried metal moves, and forgiveness for those of us who were not there for our ignorance. And in us, veterans in a forest of 1,000 fallen promises, let new leaves of protest grow on our stumps. Give us courage to answer the cry of humanity's pain, and with our bare hands, out of full hearts, with all our intelligence, let us create the peace. The closing hymn, let there be peace on earth.
Peace that was meant to be, with God Amen.